Okay, today we are going to put a new motherboard into a Gateway laptop. And this one here, the power supply has been tested out. We've gone through and tried reseating the RAM and taking out the battery and putting it back in and basically restarting the power and all that good stuff. See my videos on diagnosing laptops with no power issues. Done all that good stuff. And I'm going to go through and try and replace the motherboard on this one, because that's the most likely cause for it. AC adapter's fine. So I was going to go through and shoot this from my camera mount I've put on my window. You can kind of see it there. And of course the curtains would have been out of the way. Oh, there's my can of air that fell. But I figure this way is going to be better for you, because you can actually go through and see each individual component as I do it. So we're going to start with the first thing, unlocking our battery and taking that out. You just hold in your battery switch, pull out your battery. And with any laptop, because I'm not bothering to read the manual for this one here, because they're all pretty generic, we're just going to go through and start with taking off all the available back panels, because usually there's some kind of hidden screw under them, or it's at least going to be holding in something either way. So I'm going to go through, take out all these screws. Okay, so we've undone all the screws on our back panel here, and we're just going to set that over to the side. And now we're going to start on the next panel, covering it up, of course. Our hard drive cover here, single screw on that, and of course I'm covering up the Windows label. And our back panel just lifts off. Put that to the side. Sometimes the hard drives have an additional screw to hold them in, or a set of screws along the edge. This one, it's just floating in here, so I'm just going to give it a slide, lift it up and out. Not going to bother taking it out of the drive caddy because it's not needed. Now, since I know we're going to have to go through and take the memory out anyway, since we're swapping the motherboard, I'm going to go ahead and take them out now. And you just basically push these two tabs out and lift the memory up. And then repeat that for the one underneath. So you do the top one and then the bottom one. As you can see, the memory pops up pretty straight easily. Just that single flick picks it up. Put that over to the side. Now, depending on your laptop, you may have access to your wireless card from the bottom. I would say to go ahead, and if you do, to go ahead and disconnect it. And when you do, make note of the actual wireless card connection. This is the wireless card on this one. One is usually going to be a black wire, the other one's going to be a gray one. It's just a matter of marking which is which. What I like to do is just put like a little black marker mark on the black one, in case I'm concerned about losing it. But generally, if for some reason you've forgotten which is which, the black is main and the gray is auxiliary. In general, I have seen that are some that are the other way around, and some that have a third wire, usually for Bluetooth or something of that sort. Now, generally, they do come up pretty easy. You can just kind of go through and just either pluck them up with your fingers, like so. Some are very stubborn or have gotten in there really tight due to heat or some other issue. But if you have some forceps, you just basically clamp them on there and give it a little bit of a wiggle, because the forceps are going to have a little bit more grip than your fingers will. Wiggle a little bit. A little bit. It should pop up. Now be careful when you do this. right in the middle there. You can kind of see a little gold tip in the center. Make sure that is not bent and that you do not bend it. Same thing for the other connection. On the reverse side of the connector here, you basically have a receptacle for that to go into. Again, you're probably not going to be able to see this, this is so small, but make sure that's not bent and that the single gold connection in the middle is not missing or damaged in any way. Repeat the process for the second connection. And with the two cables out of the way, you can go through and use a screwdriver and remove the screws that are most likely holding in your wireless card. And these will usually either pop up after you're done, kind of like how this one is. I'm already taking out the one screw and it wants to come up. And be sure to keep track of your screws, as I'll show you later. And your card comes out. And I generally keep whatever screw, in this case a screw that came off of this, I keep them together. That way I don't mix up what goes with what, and I know that, hey, this thing had a single screw to it. Despite the fact that you'll see two standoffs here, it only had one screw. Laptops will do that to you. They kind of just like to screw around with your brain. And that's why in the next part we're going to do here, taking all the screws out of the back panel. As you can see, there's quite a few going down the side here. You see all these various screws all along the edge. That's a lot of them. And there's some in the middle and all that good stuff. What I do is I go through and I unscrew each one and I kind of lay it out in front of me in a pattern. So this screw will go there, this screw will go over there with it. It's easier to show you that one to take them out. But try and keep your screws matched up in a pattern is my recommendation. It's easier to do. If you do have a spec sheet for your laptop on what screws go where, piece of cake. Just keep track of all the screws in separate containers by type and you're good to go for that. But most of the time technicians don't bother with keeping those kind of manuals around because it's just kind of slows you down, and doing it my way I think is faster. Starting with the first screw here for the optical drive here in the middle, and common thing will happen, you go through, you undo the screw and you just can't get it out with your screwdriver. You could go through, flip your laptop over and get it out that way. But you can spend several minutes doing this for each and every screw at the end of the thing when you're done. So just get yourself one of these little neodymium magnets or a little high-powered magnet. Put it on your screwdriver and guess what? It magnetizes it. So if you put it in here, get on your screw a little bit, give it a little twist and it should come out pretty good. In some cases, you may have to go through and lower it a little bit further down on your screwdriver if you have a kind of a heavier metal screwdriver like I do. And there you go. It'll just lift right on up. Going through and removing that optical drive, I just showed you taking that screw out. So now the trick is getting the actual drive itself out. Some laptops, you have a nice little lip here you can actually go through, and on like the back side of this you could take something like a black stick and push in here and it'll dislodge it, or there's like a little tab sitting here you can just kind of push up with your finger, or just conveniently there's a like drive release slider or something like that. This laptop doesn't have any of those nice features. In fact, it likes to do it the annoying way, which is basically you have to take a small screwdriver, as I showed in my other videos for getting CDs out of stuck CD drives, put it into the pinhole, and that'll make the drive pop out. And what you can do is you slide out until you can get a hold of the two rails here, these metal rails. You don't want to get a hold of the drive itself because you could kind of screwed up. See how the cable is in here. I've seen some where it gets really tight, and you can mess with that. But generally, if you grab a hold of these rails, what you can do is slide it a little bit. Had to use two hands there to hold the laptop still. Give it a tug, and then you can kind of collapse your drive back in on itself to protect your lens, and then you can slide your optical drive out. And see, that's the little tab that you could normally see inside here, but you can't get to it because they have plastic all the way down on this side. So, yay. But that's to get the CD drive out. Set that over to the side with its screw. And now we can actually do the screws on. Alright, and now as you can see, gone through, taking out all the screws out of every single one of these, and I'm double checking myself here, and it looks like they're all out. Now, as you can kind of more easily see, I've gone through, and excuse the blurriness of that, and lined up the screws in relation to how they are in the system. As you can see, many of these are close, but different sizes. Some are completely different sizes. Some are close and easily confusable sizes. And that's why I always do the pattern layout thing. The reason for that is I know in relation to what size screws should be going in what spots, all that stuff. Some I could easily guess putting them back in, what size screw that is, but I find it's best and easiest to just do this layout pattern trick, and that way you don't really have to use any conscious thought as to going, what is that? Only when you make a complete screw up and just knock them all off the table or something like that do you have to go about doing it. So now we're going to go ahead, flip this guy back around, and start on the top part of the computer. Okay, first thing I do when I flip it over, start working on the top part to remove the keyboard bezel. As I look on the back of them to see, is the top bezel looped around and how it's looped around, first of all. In this case it is. And further, it's screwed in with two screws on each side. So I'm going to go ahead and just simply remove those screws, and then we can start taking off the bezel. And we open it up. Now we can see what we actually got here. Here's the other side of the bezel that loops around, and here is, of course, our little line. This is actually the separation line of the actual front power bezel or button bezel. Sometimes it's called keyboard bezel. And the plastic itself. Now, not all laptops are the same. Sometimes this is just a decorative design and you can't actually pry that up. Sometimes this whole top piece is a single piece. So again, check your manual, but I'm pretty familiar with Gateway laptops, so I'm not going to bother. So open up your screen all the way in the case of this one, and what I'm going to do is try and pop up at the hinges here to kind of release those because they tend to kind of push the whole thing down. So I'm going to pop that up here with my black stick. Again, the black sticks are just a piece of plastic, or sometimes like a rubberized plastic, and I just kind of pop it up there. And in this case, it gave me a lot of leverage on this side here, so I can just kind of work my way on down here. I'm going to do the same thing at this end. Switch ends. Again, I just kind of work it in a little bit. And I can just kind of lift up a little bit, give it a little bit of a pull. And in this case, it doesn't want to give. So I sometimes go through and try on the other side of it, because sometimes it's latched on a little bit more stubborn than others. kind of hard for you to see, I know, sorry for that. But this one seems stubborn on this side. That's to be expected, sometimes that happens. So I'm just going to go through, use my black stick, and pry along the edges here. And that was a normal snap sound, the little clicks in here, or snaps I should say, for it. And now we can go through and lift this up a little bit more. And it appears to be we've got just a stubborn corner here. So we're going to go through, get our black stick right under here. Take care not to damage the keyboard, because the keyboard is a pain to fix if you pop a key off accidentally. So I'm going to need 2 hands for this. But generally I'm going to go through, pull this up, and at the same time put a little bit of pressure on this to kind of lift it up to help this come out. Okay, now take care of the power button area when you're pulling it up, especially on Gateway laptops. Most of the laptops you have a circuit board directly underneath or something like that. Gateway laptops like to do this really cheap thing where you've got this transparent cheap plastic that basically acts like a glowing power on light, and as you can see it's got that little kind of whitish colored plastic there you're going to see in the middle of that black circle. And what can happen is while you're trying to go through and get under here to pry it up, I've seen sometimes the tool gets lodged between the gray plastic here and that white piece, and people go to pry it and it just pops right out, because that's basically just melted on, so to say. Those 3 circles that you're seeing, 2 at the top, 1 at the bottom, those are like weld marks, best way I can describe it, for the power button. So we'll put that to the side, and we're also going to put with it our screws that went along with it. And now we can start on the next part, which is going to be removing the keyboard. Keyboards are pretty straightforward. Usually there's 2 or 3 screws holding them in. In this case we have 1 in the middle and 2 at each end, even though there are holes for 2 more. Like I said again, try and keep the screws with the object, because sometimes if you do what some techs do, just create a pile of screws and go through later, you're going to see something like this keyboard, and you're going to kind of lose track of, did I need to put 4 in here, 3, 2, or what? So just go through, undo the screws, and then we can lift this thing out. Alright, with the screws out, you can usually just lift the keyboard up, give it a little pull towards the front of the system, or screen I should say, and then flip it over. Usually. Sometimes you got to do it the other way around, but and you'll see you got this nice little ribbon cable, and this here, this little white guy, is what we call a zero insertion force connector, it looks like. And basically this guy should just kind of slide this way. If you can see the small screwdriver here, it should just slide that way, this white piece. And the best thing to do for that is to take really your fingernail, and kind of get in there and push it. If you use a screwdriver and do it, if the plastic is old or cheap or a softer plastic, you can actually go through and like chip off pieces of this and damage the connector. Your fingernail is generally going to be softer than it, so if your fingernail starts giving way, you've got problems and might have to resort to using something like the forceps and going through and trying to get a huge grip like that and pulling on it. And again, like I was saying before, I'm doing this one without a manual, but like I said, I tried the trick with the fingernail and it wasn't moving. So what I did is I figured, well, it could be a flip opener, so I just took my fingernail again, just pulled up on it just slightly because my fingernail is going to be weaker than the plastic, and sure enough, it just popped up. So just kind of slide it out, the ribbon cable, put your keyboard to the side, keep the screws with it, going through and disconnecting any extra cables going from the underside of the keyboard to the system. Usually you're going to have something like this here for the trackpad. And again, this is another flip-top connector. These are almost always flip-top connectors. Just flip it up, pull it out. We have our graphics connector. These guys usually have some kind of clip here, or sometimes they're a real big solid connector that pops up. Usually some kind of little ribbon pulling cable on it. This guy here, we're going to have to squeeze it in and pull it out. That's another two-handed job. There we go. These ones with the metal clips can be a little stubborn, especially on short quarters. Basically, you have to squeeze them both together and pull it out. At the same time, use your other hand to kind of lift it and pull it. They're annoying. So, this one's pretty simple. There's no real cable routing to keep track of, but more complex laptops, just make sure you keep track of the wire routing. This one already has a nice predefined channel, so all I gotta do is just pull the wire out of it and hold onto the laptop so it doesn't flip over in the process. Take very, very delicate care of the video cable, because as you can see on this connector here, that's a lot of pins there, which should tell you there's a lot of cables in there. Very, very small, very, very thin cables, and they can get broken extremely easily. Now, another thing that will also happen is these video cables will often have a separate power connection or separate video feed to them. So as you can see, this guy has the connection here, but we also have that there. Sometimes you also see bundled up in here things for like a camera, and sometimes they'll just go through and bundle up your wireless cable as well. So in this case, we've got that there. I could try and go through and pluck it out with my fingers, but they're not really going to fit in there, and I don't feel like really squeezing them in there. And you don't want to go through and try pulling on those small wires there, because they will sometimes just completely separate from that connector. So again, we use our favorite tool, the forceps, and wow, they fit in there just perfectly. And just easily grip onto each side of it, wiggle a little bit, and it comes out like butter. And again, take care of the orientation of the cable routing, all that good stuff. Be very careful with it. Pull that out. And also with this here are the two cables from before that we did for the wireless. So I want to flip it over, push the cable through this opening, route them through, and then we can go on to the next part, which is removing the LCD panel, which should be just removing those 4 screws and the other 2 on the back. So we're going to take off the monitor now, the actual LCD panel. Sometimes there's additional screws on the back. Remember those screws that I said earlier? Those are not for the monitor here. In fact, this is a little bit of a cheaper design, so to say. You just got the 2 screws here and the 2 screws there. And we're just going to take them out in our LCD panel. Now that we've disconnected all this good stuff and got the cables out of the way, we'll lift straight up. Now, something important to do is while you're removing these screws out of the monitor, be sure that you are supporting the screen with your hand, because the only thing holding those screws in, or the monitor in, is those screws. So as you take them off, the screen can try to fall back on you, and if you're not ready for it, it can land on those screws that you probably have sitting right behind where the computer was. Now that's no good. And now we're in the home stretch, where we're going to actually take off the top bezel from the laptop. And generally it's just held in with a couple more screws. Usually you have some that's kind of around where the monitor was. Sometimes there's some under the where the monitor itself sits. We've got one in the corner here. We've got one in the middle here. And we got one that snuck its way right there. So we should be able to remove those 4 screws, and this will just pick right on up off of the system. Now we've removed all these cables, so let's do it. As you can see, again, I kept the kind of pattern idea down. It was in a general T shape, and as we see, I go through and I compare it. These 2 screws are close in size, but they're just slightly off, and that's why I'm keeping them in their pattern. And this one, of course, was way off in comparison to it. So now we should be able to pull it off. Okay, this laptop has a little bit of an unusual design. Helping hold together the top and bottom pieces, for some reason, they've decided to use the heatsink to help do it. So you notice this here is in the bottom, but some of these screws for this go into the top. I wouldn't say they help hold it together, but it kind of does. Generally, I wait to take off the heatsink until I get the motherboard out of the system, but we're going to go ahead and just do it now because, well, we don't have a choice. Now, with the cross section here, since we're taking it off, it's not too important, but when putting it back together, be sure to tighten it down in the same numbered pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, or however it's numbered on yours. That helps keep the pressure even on it and provides a good seal for the thermal compound. I'm going through and basically just loosening these up a little bit and then going through and actually completely releasing them. These are captive screws, so they will not come out all the way. So don't try and take them out completely. They'll just kind of keep spinning. And then again, we have our good old friend, a cable that, yeah, I could try and pull this up with my fingers, but the forceps do a better job. The ones for heat sinks, these power cables, fan cables, they do tend to melt on some gateways and cheaper laptops. So don't be surprised if you have trouble with it. Take your time and don't get frustrated. Give it a break or two if it's getting to you. And we can go through and lift this out here. And now we can start working on the rest of this. Okay, so went ahead, flipped it over. Basically the top part will come off pretty easily, just kind of pry around a little bit. This particular laptop had a little trick. Like I said in the beginning, each laptop's going to have its own little tricks to it and aren't usually documented. This one here, not only do we have the heat sink, like I just showed you, taking that off, but the inner connector here for the TV out, you got to kind of push with your pry tool, get it kind of here and kind of push the plastic itself, this bezel, out away from it so you can slide it up because it's part of your motherboard. And same thing with your FireWire too. If you try and pull this whole piece up with it, that's going to want to come with it. So you got to kind of very carefully come in from the bottom of it, pry in there, and give it a little twist, and it'll come up. Now, once that's out, you have kind of a double catch here. You got to basically kind of tilt it and give it a little bit of a wiggle, and it will release some extra tabs you have here at the bottom, and your top piece comes off. Keep your screws with your top piece in the same order you found them. Okay, so with our top cover removed, we pretty much have access to our motherboard. Now, something you should note is, again, each motherboard's going to look different, so don't expect your laptop motherboard to look like this one here. But now's a good time to take your replacement motherboard and basically kind of overlay it with this. You know, just lay it down kind of on top of it, make sure it lines up as far as the size of it. Check, you know, that it's got the same screw holes, same chip layout, check a couple things on, make sure it's the same. It's not unusual to see on some motherboards where maybe a wire has been soldered onto a part or two and it kind of just runs along somewhere else. Those are what we call engineering changes. They've changed them down the road because they realize that sometimes the current doesn't work, or sometimes that's just a refurbished board too. So keep that in mind. Do question any sellers that sell you one of those. Generally with motherboards though, taking them out, you're going to have screws here, usually marked with an arrow or a label for which ones you want to remove. Because if you go through and look at them, you're going to have screws all over the place for various things, and you don't have to remove them all. They can be just there to hold in some other things altogether. If we go through and actually look at this board here, you can kind of see there's some chips and some other gunk in here, and that possibly led to the unfortunate demise of this laptop. And it looks like that might even be cigarette ashes. Hard to tell, but stuff like that gets onto your board, shorts out one thing, and that is it. So please do not eat, smoke, drink, etc. over your laptop. You're just asking for trouble. A desktop is another thing altogether, but the laptops, they are very intolerant to things like that. So go through, look for the screws with the arrows on them, or some other kind of little indicator like that. There can be anywhere between, like, I've seen some just have one, to some having like 10. So try and keep track of those. And generally there's usually one on one side, one on the other, and one in another corner. And this one's kind of got them all over the place. Another thing to keep in mind, you do have things like this extra USB port, network card, all that. And they have a special cable that runs under the laptop motherboard here. And sometimes you can access that through the other side of the system. In this case, you see we won't be able to because of plastic in the way. So what we'll have to do is just go through, take those screws out here and lift it up. Some people will go through and take out the extra boards and disconnect the cable that way. I generally don't like to do that because every time you take something off, you risk damaging it. I would rather take it off in the one place under here and not have to worry about possibly damaging that connector or that board. Okay, we got our screws out, and now I'm going to show you one of the little banes of most of the laptops, at least older ones, because I'm noticing this design slowly going away on newer computers. Usually has some kind of SD card slot, but usually some kind of audio jacks on the front. And these jacks are, of course, built into your motherboard, and they got these holes, and they usually stick out of these holes a little bit. So the bad side to this is that your system board, you have this here on the front, and then on the back you have your video card, and that's sticking out the back. Well, for that to basically either that to come out or this to come out, one of the two plastics have to move. So you can either put your pry tool, and I generally kind of use these guys because they're a little bit more durable and generally aren't used as much, and kind of just pry between them and the plastic, and the board kind of flexes just a little and it'll pop up, and the plastic flexes more so though, so that'll pop that up. But that's a bane annoyance on almost every laptop. Keep that in mind. And now we get to do the last screws on this, which are 2 hex bolts or standoffs. And if you have any good hex driver for you, you just put them in there, spin it around, take them out, and then we can take this off. And not all the graphics cards have to be done this way. Only some of them. So if you go through and you basically take that out, and then you go through and give these a tug to start taking them out, It doesn't seem to want to go. Just take a look at it and verify that it really isn't of this design. And if you just want to be paranoid, yes, you can just undo these and take them out, because it really won't hurt anything. And with that done, you should be able to go through, lift your motherboard out. Again, more gotchas. So went ahead, flipped the laptop over while it's still in the case here after undoing those bolts. Undid our bottom cable, as I said, and you can kind of see a little bit of deformation there. That's just from using the forceps from trying to get it out, but it doesn't want to come off. Well, if you kind of follow my finger there a little bit, you see there's a tiny little wire that goes up, and it's a modem cable. So we're going to go through, undo that. Alright, so I got the new board in here after some finagling with the wires under there. As you can see, it doesn't have that salted, corroded look from the other one. Sometimes these tiny little capacitors like those in the middle, those can sometimes bust and give you that greenish powdery look to it. But the other one is just full of corrosion here, and that's all it takes, a little bit of corrosion, create a short, and it's no good. So I'm going to go through and reassemble it. Generally, reassembly is just the exact reverse of reassembly is just the exact reverse of taking it apart. There are some little catches, just make sure you don't crimp any of your wires when you're putting them back in. Just double check that they're in their right spot, following their little wiring guide, and that you don't leave any screws out. So I'm going to go through, put it back together. Next thing you're going to see is putting in the processor after actually screwing the motherboard. Okay, with all of our screws back in the motherboard, we're going to go ahead and put our top panel back on, and just basically goes on exactly the same like I said. So it comes off, go around, basically snap everything back together. Again, take care of that crazy port, because for some reason they designed it this way. You're going to have to go through, use a tool and kind of pry that around it. Be careful not to bend the actual connector there. Same thing with your S-Video output. And go through and attach your ribbon cables. Trick to putting in these little ribbon cables again is generally they have this tiny little plastic tab. You can barely see it, but I'm grabbing onto it. What you can do is kind of use that to kind of guide it in. And if you just push, kind of put a little bit of pressure with your finger against it this way, at the same time you lower down that lever, lock it in there real good, and that way it's got a nice solid connection. Alright, now with the front, or I should say top bezel on, I'm going to go ahead and start transferring the processor. The reason I did that is I didn't want to risk any damage to any components on the other side, so I can put something on it to cover it, the better. So, to remove the processor from the old system, what you want to do is go through, and this little circular dealy here is basically a locking mechanism. If you just rotate it, see the processor shift a little bit. It's going to be a little stubborn on me here. There we go. That unlocks it, and it'll say on each one, you can probably barely make it out because it's one of these engraved onto the surface things, but there's the open one, there's the closed engravement, and just go through, rotate it to the appropriate position, and pull it out. Now there's something you're going to notice on this processor here. See a little bit of discoloration there. This processor was running a bit on the hot side, and if I go ahead and take it off now, we can look at the bottom of it, I don't see anything wrong there. Looks good. I like to go through and make sure all the pins are straight, because if I can, I like to prevent issues. And we'll just go ahead, transfer that to the new board, which is already in its open position. You don't need to use any force at all. I like to just kind of drop them there, give them a little wiggle, and then lock it back in. And that's nice and solid. Now, as I was saying before, we had the discoloration. What they have here is one of these little thermal pads, so to say. Unfortunately, the way this thing is designed, we will have to basically use it again. If it has like a raised surface, which this one doesn't, you could put some thermal grease on there, but don't just scrape off this silver panel, because that is your thermal contact. You take it off, there's no thermal contact, and this thing is just a piece of junk. So, another thing you're going to notice is we got this raised square here and this kind of discolored square there, which goes along with these guys. Unfortunately, the guys who got or made the motherboard here, shipped me, whatever you want to say, did not include those thermal pads. So we're going to have to go through, put some new thermal pads on it, make sure they're getting a nice good thermal conductivity through it. These do appear to be of some varying thickness. We got a very thin one here, and we've got a hunk of one there. So you could reuse them, kind of, but the thing is, the grease of your fingers getting on them is going to ruin the conductivity of the thermal transfer. So if you're going to have to go that route because you don't have anything else, use rubber gloves when you go through and pull them off, and reapply them back on the same way. And if possible, take a piece of rubbing alcohol and clean the surfaces beforehand. Get a nice good transfer of heat. That way there's no grime or dirt on them. Okay, before you go through and finally put your heatsink in, since you've already taken all this effort to take this crazy machine apart, go ahead and clean out your heatsink. It doesn't take much. Just blow some canned air into it, of course while it's out of the system. Be sure to blow some into the vents along the side, top sides, all that stuff. And if you see pieces of hair in it, which I apparently missed one, pull it out, because that will get it nice and clean, and that way you get good airflow and you don't overheat. Now, speaking of heat, key thing is make sure you have good tension onto your heatsink. And as before, each one of these are numbered. You don't have to do them in the exact number, but generally as long as you do the X pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can even do 1, 2, 3, and then 4, which is what I subliminally usually do. But you go through, initially get them in, do a little bit at a time, and then just keep working until they literally stop. But don't crank 1 all the way down and then start on 2. I try and get them about halfway, then work on the next one, then work on the next one, until finally they're all the way in like they are right now. And now once they're all the way in, I'm going to use my other hand here to do this. I generally try and give them about somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 turn for tightness, to make sure they are on there nice and good. Especially with these guys here to have basically just the contact style and you can't put thermal paste on them. You definitely want to make sure it's got a good solid contact there. And if you're fortunate enough, like in this system here, we can actually go through and open it up and directly access your heatsink like every 6 months or so. Especially if you have like one of these contact design ones, you could pull it up, clean out your dust, and reseat this guy and keep a nice solid thermal connection going on. But that's it for the heatsink. If you do have one that has the grease on it, do wipe the grease off of the processor or chipset and the heatsink and apply new paste. Shinichi is a good thermal grease to use, in my opinion, for laptops, or if you have to do the bargain basement deal, Arctic Silver can do the job, but I generally just use Arctic Silver as a cheap replacement on gateways. So now we're going to go through and reattach our screen. Okay, my recommendation for putting back the laptop screens is to go through and, of course, supporting it with one hand, put a single screw into one side of it, and then go through and put the other side in, one screw there. What happens is it's helping line up the hinges to it, and can save you some time if you go through and put both screws in here and then you find out one of these somehow is turned the wrong way and you got to readjust it by hand and whatnot. So that way you don't have to unscrew it and rescrew it and all that stuff. So once you do that, put the other two in, and then we can route our cables. Pretty straightforward. Again, like I was saying before, keep track of how you had your cables routed, and in particular the layering of it. In this case, we had the wireless network cable was actually kind of under the graphics, but the thing is we couldn't really get the graphics cable out because of this being there. So we have to kind of get that back in there first, and then we can route our network cable again. Now don't forget that while you're kind of rerouting these cables through here, kind of to make sure they can actually get to where they need to get to. Sometimes I'll go through and do exactly what you're seeing here, is kind of push them through whatever hole they're supposed to be, and then I'll flip it over, pull them through. But sometimes you can go through and route these cables exactly right, and then it's too tight for you to get it through the other side. So I kind of like to get them in there and kind of route them around everywhere I need them to be, make sure they get to where they're supposed to be. Another thing you should go through and do is make full use of your tools. And a lot of people don't seem to do this for some reason, don't understand why. But if you have tricky bends, like let's say that one right there was a little bit of a stubborn one, be sure to use like your black stick to kind of push it in there a little bit, because your fingernail can sometimes be sharper than just the edge of the black stick, kind of just nudging it in there, kind of guiding them into where they should be, and all that stuff. That way you don't risk, cutting the cable too much. I kind of try and push a little bit more with the flat side of it, and don't use the pointy tip because that can pierce shielding of the cables. And just in general, route your cables in there and then connect them up. Alrighty, now we can do our keyboard. Easiest thing I find is just kind of lay the keyboard up on the system, and then using your fingers guide it into the holder, and then using your other hand flip down the gate of it to make sure it's locked in nice and tight. Then I go through, double check it, give it a little bit of a tug like that, and it seems to be good. Then we can just guide the corners in there. Keyboard sits, and then I take a look at it, see if there's any odd bulges in it. This one seems to want to bulge across the whole back end, so it's probably just a design of the keyboard. Nothing to really be concerned about. And again, double check your wiring back there. If you have a big bulge in it, in the middle of it, is causing an issue, but this one seems to be fine. And also, as a reminder, clean your keyboard before you reinstall it, and that way you don't get gunk back in your system. Despite me blowing this one out, it seems to be just tilting it forward again, just loosened some more stuff. So now what I'm going to do is kind of go through and skip a step. I'm not going to put the keyboard bezel cover on yet. The reason for that is it's usually one of the harder pieces to get off due to the little plastic tabs, so to say. It's one of those pieces that can easily break. So I like to leave that until the very last thing, because generally you don't need it on there until you just want to make it look pretty. So I'm going to go ahead and put our wireless card back in. Since we got our keyboard back on, we can go through and see if this is going to cause any wiring issues for us. And I'm just going to go through, line it up, preferably not with the cables under it, like I just almost did. And just go on through, and these guys just kind of snap on like little buttons, so to say. So just get them on there and push down. Alrighty, going to go through and do our CD drive next. Pretty straightforward, slide it in. It's actually kind of easier than taking it out in the first place. Get it in there and just kind of give it a little bit of a push, and it just kind of goes in place. Check the hole in there, make sure it lines up. Now with all of our screws in, we're going to go through, put our RAM sticks back in. They go in just as easily as they came out. You just go through, line them up. It's a little bit easier to do when you don't have a camera in your hand, of course, but I just put them in there. I like to put 2 fingers on it and push it down so it's nice, even pressure onto the connectors that way, and it goes right on in. And same thing for the top one. Nice, even pressure, and click it down in. Alrighty. Now we're moving on up in the world here. We can put in our hard drive. Same as it came out before. If you've watched my video, see what happens if you try and put it in wrong. As I've said before in the hard drive replacement video, if you try and put it in wrong, it just doesn't go in. So it's really not hard to get these hard drives in. I don't know why so many people have trouble with them. But you just set it in. Got one of these little plastic tabs here, and just use it to push it on in. Nice tab. Now we can put our cover back on the hard drive and put our battery back in, and we can fire this thing up. Alrighty. So after you put it back together, you can hook up your power cord and test it out. You have the little power button right there. You can press that with your black stick, and that'll cut it on for you. But unfortunately, I have a bad motherboard from the guy I got it from. Found out it immediately shorts out my power supply. So, not just one power supply, but 2. But after you go through, you hook up your power cord, check your lights, see if your charging light cuts on. If it does, good. If not, then you could have something wrong with your charger, or in this case, a bad motherboard right from the get-go. And then you have your other light for your power, of course. You know, the system's on. It should turn on. But assuming everything is good, which it's going to be a while, probably before I hear back from this guy, or even probably get my money back. We go ahead, clip our top bezel back on. Just a matter of putting in the right spots and clicking it into place. And as before I've said, this is probably the hardest part of the system to put on and take off because of those stupid little snaps. They do break very, very easily. And as you can see, I'm having more problems than I think I should with it. But just go through, click it in, and check across it, like right there, it's not quite level. Make sure it seats back in. And that is it. Well, there we go. And just put our screws back in the back. You can figure that out yourself. You're pretty smart people, I guess. And that's it. That's how you go through and replace the motherboard in a laptop. Hopefully you have better luck than me in not getting a bad motherboard this time around. But that's it. Until next time, I'll see you later.